The rain had begun as a whisper against the windows of Ashford Manor, then grown into something more insistent, a steady drumming that seemed to echo the rhythm of Evelyn's anxious heart. She stood before the looking-glass in her chambers, watching her maid, Sarah, fasten the last button of her travelling dress. The fabric was a deep emerald green, chosen by Lady Beatrice with what had seemed like uncharacteristic generosity. Now studying her reflection, Evelyn wondered if even this small kindness had been poisoned with hidden meaning. "You look beautiful, Miss Evelyn," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with emotion she was trying desperately to conceal. "Lady Agatha will be pleased to receive such a fine guest." Evelyn met the maid's eyes in the mirror and saw the truth there. Sarah knew. Perhaps not the full extent of Lady Beatrice's deception, but enough to understand that this journey was not what it pretended to be. Evelyn reached back and squeezed the young woman's hand, offering silent comfort even as her own chest tightened with foreboding. "Tell me honestly, Sarah," Evelyn said softly, turning from the mirror. "Have you heard anything about this journey? Anything at all that might explain why it must happen so suddenly?" Sarah's fingers trembled as she straightened the collar of Evelyn's dress. Her mouth opened, then closed, and for a moment Evelyn thought she might actually speak. But the sound of footsteps in the corridor, heavy, deliberate, unmistakably Lady Beatrice's, sealed whatever confession had been forming on the maid's lips. The door opened without ceremony. Lady Beatrice swept into the room like a cold wind, her silk gown rustling with each calculated step. She was beautiful in the way that winter landscapes are beautiful, sharp, pristine, and utterly unforgiving. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate coils, her neck adorned with pearls that had once belonged to Evelyn's mother. That particular cruelty had never escaped Evelyn's notice, though she had learned long ago that acknowledging such things only fed Lady Beatrice's appetite for causing pain. "Still dawdling?" Lady Beatrice's voice carried that particular edge that always made the servants scatter. "The carriage has been waiting this quarter hour. Your father is already distressed by the delay." "I'm ready," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. "I was only saying goodbye to Sarah." "How touching." Lady Beatrice's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "Though I hardly think a lady of your standing should be so familiar with the staff. It's precisely this sort of common behaviour that necessitates this trip to your aunt's estate. Lady Agatha will teach you the proper distance that should exist between a gentlewoman and those who serve her." Evelyn bit back the response that rose to her lips. She had learned this restraint through years of small battles, each one teaching her that direct confrontation with Lady Beatrice only resulted in suffering, not for herself alone, but for anyone who had shown her kindness. Sarah had already paid that price once, nearly dismissed for bringing Evelyn tea during a particularly difficult night. Evelyn would not let her loyalty be punished again. "Of course, Lady Beatrice," she said instead, the words tasting like ash. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to improve myself." Something flickered in Lady Beatrice's eyes, disappointment, perhaps, that Evelyn had not taken the bait. She turned sharply toward the door, then paused, her hand resting on the frame. "Your father wishes to see you before you depart. Don't keep him waiting long. He tires so easily these days." The reminder of her father's illness sent a cold spike through Evelyn's heart. Lord Henry had been declining for months, his once robust frame now thin and fragile, his breathing laboured even on his better days. The physicians spoke in hushed tones about time, how much he might have left, how they should prepare themselves. Lady Beatrice, however, spoke only of inconvenience, of how his condition complicated the running of the household. Evelyn found her father in his study, seated by the window where pale morning light filtered through the rain-streaked glass. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the large leather chair that had once seemed to fit him perfectly, but when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had been her refuge since childhood, still held their familiar tenderness. "My dear girl," he said, extending a trembling hand toward her. "Come, sit with me a moment." She crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside his chair so she could take his hand in both of hers. His skin was paper-thin and cool, his fingers as fragile as bird bones. The reality of his mortality pressed down on her with suffocating weight, and she had to swallow hard against the tears that threatened. "Father, I don't have to go," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Lady Beatrice says it's for etiquette lessons, but I've had excellent training from Mother's instructions. There's no need for me to travel so far, especially now, when you— Hush now. He patted her hand gently, his smile sad but certain. Your stepmother is right in this matter, even if her motivations are less than pure. You need protection, Evelyn. You need security, and I— He paused, his breath catching. I won't be here to provide it much longer. Don't say that. The tears came now hot and unstoppable. Please, Father. Listen to me. His voice gained strength, drawing on reserves Evelyn didn't know he still possessed. I've spoken with Duke Blackthorne. He's a good man despite what society says about his reserved nature. He's expressed interest in courting you, and I believe, no, I know, that he could give you the life you deserve, the protection you'll need. Evelyn's breath caught at the mention of Alexander Blackthorne. She had met the Duke only twice, once at a garden party where they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, and again at a ball where he had asked her to dance. Both encounters had been brief, formal, yet there had been something in his gaze that had made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't quite understand. He was handsome, certainly, with his dark hair and striking grey eyes, but it was more than physical attraction. There had been an intensity to his attention, a focus that made her feel truly seen in a way she rarely experienced. "The Duke," she whispered. "But, Father, we barely know each other, and if I'm to be away for months— This trip to your aunt's is temporary," Lord Henry said firmly, though his hand tightened on hers. "Just long enough to satisfy propriety, to show society that you've had proper finishing. When you return, Duke Blackthorne will be waiting. He's already indicated his intentions to me. You'll be safe, my darling. That's all that matters." Evelyn wanted to protest, to tell him about the cold dread that had been building in her chest since Lady Beatrice had announced this journey. But looking at her father's face, seeing the desperate hope there mingled with the shadows of his illness, she couldn't bring herself to add to his burdens. If he needed to believe she would be safe, that his death would not leave her vulnerable and alone, then she would give him that peace. "I understand, Father," she said softly, pressing a kiss to his weathered hand. "I'll make you proud. You already have, my dear, every day of your life." They sat together in silence for a few more precious minutes, and Evelyn tried to memorize everything, the way the light caught the silver in his hair, the scent of his cologne mixed with pipe tobacco, the weight of his hand in hers. She had a terrible feeling that she was saying goodbye to more than just a temporary separation, though she couldn't name the source of her foreboding. When she finally rose to leave, Lord Henry called her back one more time. "Evelyn, remember that you are your mother's daughter. You have her strength, even when you don't feel it. And you have my love, always, no matter what comes." The words felt like a blessing and a warning all at once. Evelyn curtsied formally, the gesture suddenly feeling important, final. Then she turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. The entrance hall was bustling with activity when she descended the stairs. Footmen were loading her trunks onto the carriage. Far more luggage than seemed necessary for a brief stay, she noticed with growing unease. Lady Beatrice stood near the door, speaking in low tones with a man Evelyn didn't recognize. He wore a coachman's livery, but there was something about his bearing that seemed wrong, almost furtive. "Ah, there you are," Lady Beatrice said, her voice honey-sweet in a way that always preceded cruelty. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Thorne. He'll be your primary driver for the journey. He knows the roads to Lady Agatha's estate quite well." The man bowed, but his eyes never quite met Evelyn's. "Miss Ashford, it will be my honor to deliver you safely to your destination." Something about the way he said destination made her skin prickle with warning. But before she could examine the feeling more closely, Lady Beatrice was ushering her toward the carriage, her hand tight on Evelyn's elbow in a grip that would leave bruises. "Now remember," Lady Beatrice murmured, her voice low enough that the servants couldn't hear, "Lady Agatha expects absolute obedience. She doesn't tolerate the sort of willful behavior you've exhibited here. If you know what's good for you, and more importantly what's good for your father in his remaining days, you'll do exactly as you're told." The threat was clear, and Evelyn's stomach turned with sick realization. Her father's comfort, his care, his very medication, all of it was controlled by Lady Beatrice now. One word from her and Lord Henry's final days could be made infinitely more painful. "I understand," Evelyn whispered, hating the defeat in her own voice. Lady Beatrice smiled, satisfied, and helped Evelyn into the carriage with a show of concern that would have fooled any observer. "Safe travels, my dear stepdaughter. Do write when you arrive. Your father will worry otherwise." The door closed with a definitive thud, and Evelyn found herself alone in the plush interior, surrounded by velvet cushions and drawn curtains that suddenly felt less like luxury and more like a prison. The carriage lurched forward, and through the small window she caught one last glimpse of Ashford Manor, her home, her prison, the only life she had ever known, growing smaller in the distance. The rain continued its relentless assault as they travelled, turning the roads muddy and treacherous. Hours passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the creaking of wheels and the occasional shout from Mr. Thorne to the horses. Evelyn tried to read by the dim light filtering through the curtains, but the words swam before her eyes, meaningless. Her mind kept returning to her father's pale face, to Lady Beatrice's calculating smile, to the strange feeling that she was travelling not toward education and refinement, but toward some darker purpose she couldn't yet name. They stopped only briefly for fresh horses at a coaching inn, and Evelyn was not permitted to leave the carriage. She watched through the window as other travellers came and went, laughing and talking, free in a way she had never been. A young woman around her own age climbed into a nearby carriage, helped by a man who looked at her with such obvious affection that Evelyn felt a sharp pang of longing. What would it be like, she wondered, to be looked at that way? To be chosen rather than tolerated, loved rather than endured? She thought of Duke Blackthorne then, trying to recall the details of their encounters. He had been polite, but distant at the garden party, answering her questions about his travels with careful precision. But at the ball, when they had danced, something had shifted. He had held her a fraction closer than propriety demanded, his hand warm and steady at her waist, and when the music had ended, he had hesitated before releasing her, as if reluctant to let her go. "You have a rare quality, Miss Ashford," he had said quietly, his grey eyes intense upon her face. "A lightness that's uncommon in these dark times. I find it quite remarkable." Before she could respond, Lady Beatrice had appeared, all false smiles and honeyed words, drawing Evelyn away with practised skill. In the weeks that followed, there had been no further contact with the Duke, no calls or invitations. Evelyn had assumed he had lost interest, or perhaps Lady Beatrice had somehow discouraged his attentions. Now she wondered if there had been something more deliberate at work, a plan forming even then to remove her from his sphere entirely. The carriage jolted over a particularly rough patch of road, throwing Evelyn against the side panel. She righted herself, rubbing her shoulder where it had struck the wood, and pulled back the curtain to look out. The landscape had grown increasingly desolate, the houses fewer and farther between. They should have been approaching a town by now, according to the route Lady Beatrice had outlined, but instead they seemed to be travelling deeper into empty countryside. Evelyn knocked on the roof of the carriage, trying to get Mr. Thorne's attention. There was no response. She knocked again, harder this time, her unease blooming into genuine fear. "Mr. Thorne, I need to speak with you." Still nothing. The carriage continued its steady pace, wheels churning through mud, rain drumming an ominous rhythm overhead. Evelyn's heart began to race. She reached for the door handle, thinking to open it and call out more forcefully, but found it locked from the outside. Locked. She was trapped. Panic clawed at her chest, making it hard to breathe. She fumbled with the handle again, pulling and twisting desperately, but it wouldn't budge. This wasn't a journey to Lady Agatha's estate. Perhaps it never had been. Lady Beatrice had spoken of her sister's home, of etiquette lessons and social refinement, but those had been lies. Pretty stories to appease her father and disguise whatever true destination awaited her at the end of this terrible road. She was being taken somewhere against her will, and no one knew. No one except Lady Beatrice, and she was the architect of this nightmare. Evelyn forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite her terror. She had a small reticule with her, containing a handkerchief, a few coins, and a letter from her father that he had pressed into her hands during their goodbye. Nothing that could serve as a weapon or tool for escape. The windows were too small to climb through, even if she could break the glass. Her only hope was to reason with Mr. Thorne when they stopped, or to call for help if they passed anyone on the road. But as the hours dragged on and the landscape grew wilder, That hope dwindled. They encountered no other travelers, no villages, no signs of civilization at all. The rain intensified until the world beyond the windows was nothing but grey water and shadow. Evelyn curled into herself on the seat, arms wrapped around her body, fighting against despair. She thought of her mother then, of the stories Lord Henry had told her about the woman who had died bringing Evelyn into the world. "She was brave," he always said, "braver than anyone I've ever known. And she made me promise that you would never be made to feel small or worthless, that you would know your own value." But Lady Beatrice had worked systematically to break that promise, to chip away at Evelyn's sense of self-worth until she questioned her right to exist at all. And now, in this moment of terror, Evelyn felt the full weight of that psychological warfare. Perhaps she deserved this fate. Perhaps she had been foolish to hope for anything better. No. The thought came fierce and sudden, her mother's voice somehow clear in her mind. "No, you are worth more than this. You are worth love and protection, and all the beautiful things this world can offer. Don't let her win." Evelyn straightened in her seat, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. If this was truly happening, if she was being taken somewhere against her will, then she would face it with whatever courage she could muster. She would watch for opportunities to escape. She would fight if she had to. She would not go meekly into whatever darkness Lady Beatrice had planned. The carriage began to slow, and Evelyn's heart leaped with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Perhaps they were stopping at an inn after all. Perhaps she could call for help, could find someone who would listen, who would send word back to her father. She pressed her face to the window, trying to see through the rain-smeared glass. What she saw made her blood run cold. They had stopped in the middle of nowhere beside a dilapidated building that might once have been a coaching station, but now stood abandoned and rotting. Mr. Thorne climbed down from his seat, and Evelyn heard voices, at least 2 other men joining him. They spoke in low tones she couldn't quite make out, but their body language was furtive, conspiratorial. She was no longer dealing with a misguided journey. She was in actual danger. Evelyn looked around the carriage desperately for anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a decorative brass fitting near the window. Not much, but if she could work it loose, it might serve as a makeshift weapon. She pulled at it frantically, her breath coming in short gasps, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the metal. The sound of approaching footsteps stopped her efforts. The lock clicked, and the door swung open to reveal Mr. Thorne, his face harder now without the pretense of servitude. Behind him stood 2 rough-looking men, their clothes suggesting labourers, or worse. "End of the line, miss," Mr. Thorne said, his voice devoid of the respect he had shown earlier. "Time to get out. I'll do no such thing." Evelyn was proud that her voice came out steady, authoritative, channeling every ounce of her mother's bravery. "Take me back to Ashford Manor immediately, or my father will have you arrested." Mr. Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your father don't know where you are, girl, and by the time anyone thinks to look for you, you'll be so far away it won't matter. Now come quiet, or we'll drag you out. Makes no difference to me either way." He reached for her, and Evelyn screamed. She screamed as loudly as she could, hoping against hope that someone might hear, might come to investigate. She fought as well, kicking and clawing when his hands closed around her arms, but he was far stronger. He hauled her from the carriage with brutal efficiency while the other men laughed. They were dragging her toward the abandoned building when the sound reached them. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast, the jingle of harnesses cutting through the rain. Mr. Thorne froze, his grip on Evelyn loosening just slightly. She took advantage of his distraction to wrench herself free, stumbling backward into the mud. Around the bend in the road came a sight that seemed impossible, almost dreamlike in its sudden appearance. A fine black horse bearing a rider in a long coat, followed by what looked like a small contingent of servants on horseback. But it was the rider who commanded attention, who seemed to gather all the grey afternoon light around himself, like a storm given human form. Duke Alexander Blackthorne. He took in the scene before him with those piercing grey eyes, Evelyn on the ground, her dress torn and muddy, the men surrounding her with guilty violence written across their faces. His expression didn't change, didn't show rage or surprise, but something far more dangerous settled over his features. A cold, absolute certainty that someone was about to pay dearly for what they had done. "Step away from her," the Duke said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the distance. It wasn't a shout or a threat, it was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the weight of absolute authority. "Step away now, or I will kill every one of you where you stand." Mr. Thorne released Evelyn completely, his face draining of colour. The other men began backing away, hands raised in surrender. They might have been rough characters used to intimidating others, but they recognized something in Alexander Blackthorne that transcended social class or physical size. They recognized a predator. Alexander dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes never leaving Evelyn. He crossed the space between them quickly, but without rushing, as if afraid sudden movement might frighten her further. When he reached her, he dropped to one knee in the mud beside her, heedless of his expensive clothes. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice was gentle now, all the cold menace reserved for the men behind them. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" Evelyn tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Now that the immediate danger had passed, her body seemed to be catching up to her terror. She began to shake uncontrollably, her teeth chattering despite the relative warmth of the rain. Alexander, seeing her distress, immediately shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The garment was warm from his body heat and carried the scent of sandalwood and something else uniquely him. The simple kindness of the gesture broke through her shock, and she found her voice. "They were taking me somewhere," she managed to say through trembling lips. "Not to my aunt's estate. Lady Beatrice, she lied. This was never about etiquette lessons." "I know." Alexander's hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness, his thumb brushing away mud and tears from her cheek. "My man discovered the plot. We've been riding since dawn to catch you." His jaw tightened. "I'm sorry we didn't arrive sooner. I should have—" "You came," Evelyn interrupted, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her face. "You came for me. That's all that matters." Something shifted in his expression then, a crack in the careful control he maintained. For just a moment, she saw beneath the cool exterior to the man underneath, someone capable of fierce feeling, of genuine emotion he had learned to hide behind walls of propriety and reservation. His eyes held hers, and in that gaze she saw concern and relief and something else that made her heart stutter in her chest. The moment was broken by the arrival of his servants, who had dismounted and were now efficiently restraining Mr. Thorne and his accomplices. One of them, an older gentleman with kind eyes, approached Alexander with a blanket. "Your Grace," he said with a slight bow. "Should we send for the magistrate?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Have these men taken into custody immediately. I want every detail of Lady Beatrice's plot documented." Alexander stood, helping Evelyn to her feet with careful support. "And send word ahead to Ashford Manor. Lord Henry needs to know his daughter is safe, and that his wife has committed crimes that will not go unanswered. At once, Your Grace." Mr. Whitmore turned to carry out his orders, but not before giving Evelyn a warm smile that seemed to say she was among friends now, that the nightmare was truly over. Alexander guided Evelyn away from the scene, supporting her weight as they walked toward his horse. "Can you ride?" he asked. "It's faster than the carriage, and I want to get you somewhere warm and safe as quickly as possible." "I can manage," Evelyn said, though in truth she wasn't entirely certain. Her legs felt like water, her whole body still trembling with reaction. Alexander seemed to sense her uncertainty. "You'll ride with me," he said, making it sound like a simple statement of fact rather than a breach of propriety. "I won't let you fall." He lifted her onto the horse with easy strength, then mounted behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Evelyn found herself enclosed in his embrace, her back against his chest, his warmth surrounding her. It should have felt improper, scandalous even, but instead it felt safe. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt truly protected. They rode in silence for a while, the rain beginning to ease as they traveled back toward civilization. Evelyn could feel the steady beat of Alexander's heart against her shoulder blade, could hear his breathing even and calm despite the exertion of the ride. Gradually, her own panic began to subside, replaced by exhaustion and a strange, tentative hope. "How did you know?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "How did Mr. Whitmore discover Lady Beatrice's plan?" "He's known your stepmother for many years," Alexander replied, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back, "long enough to recognize her patterns, her cruelty. When he heard she was sending you away so suddenly, he became suspicious. He made inquiries among the staff at Ashford Manor, discreetly, of course. One of the maids, Sarah, came to him. She had overheard Lady Beatrice speaking with Mr. Thorne, making arrangements that had nothing to do with Lady Agatha's estate. Sarah. Dear, loyal Sarah, who had tried so hard to warn her without words. Evelyn made a mental note to ensure the girl was protected from Lady Beatrice's inevitable wrath. "Where was she sending me?" Evelyn asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Alexander's arms tightened slightly around her, protective. "A house far to the north near the Scottish border. Isolated, difficult to leave, owned by a man who specializes in making young women disappear. Your stepmother paid him handsomely to ensure you would never return to society, never threaten her position or her control over your father's estate." The full horror of it settled over Evelyn like a shroud. Lady Beatrice hadn't just wanted her gone, she had wanted her erased, removed so completely that even memory of her would fade. And her father, in his illness and manipulation, would have believed whatever lies his wife spun about Evelyn choosing to stay away, about improving herself, about anything, except the truth. "My father," Evelyn whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He trusted her. He believed she wanted what was best for me." "He'll know the truth now," Alexander said firmly, "and he'll have the chance to make things right before it's too late." The unspoken words hung between them. Lord Henry was dying and everyone knew it, but perhaps, Evelyn thought, he could at least die knowing his daughter was safe, knowing he had done right by her in the end. They arrived at a small but respectable inn as evening began to fall. Alexander had sent a rider ahead, and the innkeeper was waiting with rooms prepared and a fire blazing in a private parlour. He helped Evelyn down from the horse with the same careful gentleness he had shown throughout, as if she were made of porcelain and might shatter at rough handling. "Mrs. Pemberton will help you get cleaned up," he said, gesturing to a kind-faced woman who appeared in the doorway. "Take all the time you need. I'll have food sent up and we can discuss what happens next whenever you're ready." Evelyn nodded, suddenly aware of how filthy and dishevelled she must look. But as she turned to follow Mrs. Pemberton, she found herself pausing, looking back at the Duke who had saved her. He stood in the courtyard, rain-soaked and mud-splattered himself, yet somehow still carrying an air of unshakable dignity. "Your Grace," she called softly. He turned immediately, his full attention on her. "Thank you for coming for me, for believing I was worth saving." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or pain at the implication that she might doubt her own value. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, taking her hand in both of his. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low and intense, "you are worth far more than you know, and I hope when this is all settled you'll allow me the honour of proving that to you, every day for as long as you'll permit it." The promise in his words, the certainty in his eyes, sent warmth flooding through her chest. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, perhaps never, but it was something real and solid and true. It was the foundation of something that could grow, given time and patience and the courage to believe in the possibility of happiness. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." His smile transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened by whatever weights he normally carried. He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that was perfectly proper, yet somehow intimate, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then we have much to look forward to, Miss Ashford. But first, let's get you warm and safe. The rest can wait." Evelyn allowed Mrs. Pemberton to lead her inside, but she looked back once more to find Alexander still watching her, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. She thought of her father's words about the Duke being a good man, about him providing the protection she would need. At the time, it had sounded like a convenient arrangement, a practical solution to the problem of her future. Now, wrapped in his coat and carrying the memory of his fierce protectiveness, she wondered if it might be something more. If, perhaps against all odds and despite Lady Beatrice's best efforts to destroy her, she might actually find not just safety, but genuine affection. Maybe even love. The night ahead would bring difficult conversations and hard truths. But for now, for this moment, Evelyn allowed herself to hope. And hope, she was discovering, could be its own kind of courage. The following morning broke clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night like a fever finally breaking. Evelyn woke in an unfamiliar bed, disoriented for a moment before memory came flooding back. The attempted abduction, Alexander's dramatic rescue, the promise in his voice when he spoke of their future. She sat up slowly, her body aching from yesterday's ordeal, and found a tray of tea and toast waiting on the bedside table, still warm. Mrs. Pemberton must have brought it while she slept. The kindness of the gesture, so simple and yet so thoughtful, brought fresh tears to Evelyn's eyes. She had spent so long in Lady Beatrice's cold household, where every gesture came with strings attached, and every kindness demanded payment, that she had almost forgotten what genuine care felt like. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss Ashford?" came Alexander's voice, respectfully muffled through the wood. "I apologize for disturbing you so early, but there's news from Ashford Manor. When you're ready, I'd like to speak with you." Evelyn's heart clenched at the serious tone in his voice. She dressed quickly in the clean clothes Mrs. Pemberton had laid out, simple garments borrowed from the innkeeper's daughter, but clean and warm. When she opened the door, she found Alexander waiting in the corridor, looking as if he hadn't slept at all. There were shadows under his eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a long, difficult night. "What's happened?" she asked immediately, fear making her voice sharp. "Is it my father?" "Come," Alexander said gently, offering his arm. "Let's speak somewhere more comfortable." He led her to the private parlour, where a fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, at odds with the gravity of the moment. Mr. Whitmore was already there, standing respectfully near the window. Both men waited until Evelyn was seated before Alexander began, and even then he seemed to struggle with how to deliver whatever news he carried. "Your father is alive," he said first, and Evelyn felt herself breathe again. "But he's taken a turn for the worse. When he learned of Lady Beatrice's betrayal, when he understood the full scope of what she had planned for you—" Alexander paused, his jaw working. The shock weakened him considerably. The physicians say it's only a matter of days now, perhaps less. Evelyn pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back a sob. She had known this was coming, had seen her father failing for months, but the reality of it, the cruel proximity of it, struck her like a physical blow. "I need to go to him," she said, standing abruptly. "Right away. He shouldn't be alone. He shouldn't—" "He's asked for you," Alexander interrupted gently, "and I'll take you to him immediately. But there's more you need to know before we arrive." Evelyn sank back into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles went white. "Tell me everything." Mr. Whitmore stepped forward, his expression grave. When word reached Ashford Manor of what had transpired, Lord Henry summoned Lady Beatrice to his chambers. I have this from the household staff who were present. He confronted her with the evidence of her plot, and she did not deny it. In fact, she seemed to take pride in her actions, believing herself justified in protecting what she saw as her rightful claim to his estate. "Her rightful claim," Evelyn repeated, her voice hollow. "My father's estate was never hers to claim. His will leaves everything to me, protected by trustees until I marry or reach the age of 30. "Precisely," Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Which is why Lady Beatrice was so determined to remove you from the picture entirely. With you gone, declared lost or dead, she could contest the will. She had already begun laying the groundwork with various solicitors, painting you as unstable, unfit to inherit. If you had disappeared as she planned, there would have been no one to contradict her narrative. The calculated nature of it, the long-term planning required to orchestrate such a scheme, made Evelyn feel sick. What happened after my father confronted her?" "He ordered her from the house," Mr. Whitmore said quietly. "Not just dismissed from his presence, but legally separated and stripped of all rights to his name and property. The papers were drawn up last night and signed this morning. Lady Beatrice Montclair is no longer Lady Ashford. She has been returned to her family in disgrace, with only the dowry she brought to the marriage. Everything else, the jewels, the property rights, the social standing, all of it is forfeit." "She'll be ruined," Evelyn said, and was surprised to find she felt no satisfaction in it, only a hollow sadness. Lady Beatrice had destroyed herself through her own machinations, and while justice had been served, it felt empty. No amount of punishment could restore the years of cruelty, the childhood stolen, the confidence systematically demolished. She made her choices, Alexander said, reading the conflict in Evelyn's face. And she must live with the consequences. Your sympathy does you credit, but don't waste too much of it on someone who would have seen you vanish without a trace. He was right, of course. But Evelyn had spent so long trying to understand her stepmother, trying to find some crack in the armor of cruelty that might explain it, that letting go of that need felt strange. Perhaps that too was part of Lady Beatrice's legacy, the compulsion to excuse the inexcusable, to take responsibility for others' choices. "We should leave soon," Alexander continued, glancing toward the window where morning sun streamed through. "The journey is several hours, and your father is asking for you specifically. He wants to see you settled before—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Evelyn nodded, straightening her spine. "I'm ready. Let me just collect my things." "There's one more matter to discuss," Alexander said, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply. He seemed uncomfortable, a rare crack in his usual composure. "Your father has made a request, one that concerns both of us." Evelyn waited, her heart beginning to pound with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "He's asked that we marry," Alexander said quietly. "Before he passes, he wants to see you protected, wants to know that you'll be safe and provided for, and he wants—" Alexander's gaze met hers directly. "He wants to see you happy, if only for a moment. To know that his death won't leave you alone in the world." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marriage, to a man she barely knew, had met only a handful of times, whose rescue of her yesterday had been driven by— what exactly? Duty, compassion, something more. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked, needing to understand his feelings in this. "You've already saved me, already gone far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect. You don't owe me marriage simply because my father wishes it." Alexander moved closer, dropping to one knee before her chair so they were at eye level. The gesture was intimate, almost romantic, and made her breath catch in her throat. "I told you yesterday that you were worth more than you knew," he said softly. "Let me explain what I meant." He reached for her hand, holding it gently in both of his. "When I first saw you at that garden party, I thought you were beautiful. But beauty is common in our world, Miss Ashford. What struck me was the light you carried, the way you spoke with genuine interest about ideas and books and the world beyond society's narrow confines. You treated everyone you encountered with kindness, not the performative kindness of the privileged, but real consideration for their humanity." "That's hardly remarkable," Evelyn protested weakly. "It is when you understand how rare it has become," Alexander countered. "I've spent my life navigating a world where everyone wants something, where every smile hides calculation, and every word serves an agenda. But you were different. You asked me about my travels, not because you were trying to impress me or secure a proposal, but because you genuinely wanted to know. You saw me as a person, not a title." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "After that day, I made inquiries, discreet ones through Mr. Whitmore. I learned about your situation at home, about Lady Beatrice's cruelty, about your father's illness. I learned that you spent your allowance on books for the village school, that you visited sick tenants despite your stepmother forbidding it, that you had befriended a young maid everyone else ignored." "Sarah," Evelyn whispered, surprised he knew these details. "Sarah," he confirmed with a small smile, "who risked her position to try to warn you about Lady Beatrice's plot. The loyalty you inspire, Miss Ashford, Evelyn, that speaks volumes about who you are. And I found myself thinking about you constantly, wanting to know more, wanting to see that light again, wanting—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "Wanting you." Evelyn's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "But you barely spoke to me after that first meeting. I thought you had lost interest." "I stayed away because I was trying to determine the right approach," Alexander admitted. "Your stepmother was clearly threatened by any attention I showed you. I thought that if I waited, if I first secured your father's blessing formally, I could protect you from her machinations. But I waited too long, was too cautious, and nearly lost you as a result." His hands tightened on hers. "I won't make that mistake again." "So you want this marriage?" Evelyn asked, needing absolute clarity. "Not as an obligation or a duty, but genuinely." "I want the chance to know you better," Alexander said carefully. "I want the opportunity to see if what I feel, this pull toward you, this sense that you're someone extraordinary, is the beginning of something deeper. I can't promise you passionate love right now because we barely know each other, but I can promise you honesty, respect, protection, and the sincere effort to build something real between us." It was perhaps the most practical proposal Evelyn could imagine, and yet there was something refreshing about his candor. He wasn't promising her fairy tales or overwhelming passion. He was offering her a partnership, a chance to grow something genuine in a world that trafficked in artificial sentiment. "What if we discover we don't suit each other?" she asked quietly. "What if this chance you speak of leads nowhere?" "Then we'll be honest about that too," Alexander replied. "I won't trap you in a miserable marriage, Evelyn. If we truly cannot find common ground, we'll make arrangements that allow you freedom and independence. You'll have my name and my protection, my fortune at your disposal, but you won't be forced into proximity if it causes you pain." "That seems like a rather poor bargain for you," Evelyn observed. "Not if it means you're safe," Alexander said simply. "Not if it means Lady Beatrice, or anyone like her, can never touch you again. I've lived my life alone, Evelyn. I'm comfortable with solitude if necessary, but I'd rather try for something more." Evelyn looked at him kneeling before her, this powerful man who had ridden through a storm to save her, who spoke with such careful honesty about his feelings and limitations. She thought about her father's wish to see her settled, about the very real need for protection in a world that offered women few choices. But more than that, she thought about the possibility Alexander represented, the chance to build something authentic, rather than settling for what was expected. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll marry you. Not just because my father wishes it or because I need protection, but because I'd like to try too. I'd like to see if this pull you describe, this sense of something possible between us, is real." Relief and something warmer flooded Alexander's expression. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her shiver. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise you won't regret this choice." "I should probably warn you that I have opinions," Evelyn said, a hint of her natural humor returning. "About books and politics and social reform. Lady Beatrice always said it made me difficult." "Lady Beatrice was a fool," Alexander replied, standing and pulling her gently to her feet. "I don't want an ornament or an echo, Evelyn. I want a partner with thoughts of her own. Your difficulty, as she called it, is precisely what makes you interesting." They stood close together, his hands still holding hers, and Evelyn felt the weight of the moment. This was really happening. In a matter of hours she would be married to this man, would tie her life to his in ways that couldn't easily be undone. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt a cautious hope taking root. "We should go," Alexander said reluctantly. "Your father is waiting." The journey to Ashford Manor was nothing like Evelyn's attempted departure the previous day. She rode in Alexander's well-appointed carriage, warm and safe, with Mr. Whitmore riding alongside as escort. Alexander sat across from her, and they spoke in fits and starts, small revelations about themselves, tentative explorations of each other's thoughts and interests. She learned that he had travelled extensively in his youth, seeking escape from the suffocating expectations of his title, that he loved the opera but attended rarely because he disliked the social performance it required, that he had a younger sister who had died in childhood, and that loss had shaped his protective instincts toward those he cared for. He learned that she wrote poetry in secret, never showing it to anyone because Lady Beatrice had mocked her early attempts so mercilessly. That she dreamed of seeing the world beyond England's borders, but had never travelled farther than London. That she still missed her mother with an ache that never quite faded, and that sometimes she talked to her in her mind, seeking guidance from a woman she had never known. By the time Ashford Manor came into view, they weren't strangers anymore. They weren't intimately familiar either, but they had made a beginning, and for now, that felt like enough. The household was subdued when they arrived, servants moving quietly through the halls, with the particular solemnity that accompanied death's approach. The family physician, Dr. Harrison, met them in the entrance hall, his expression grave. "Miss Ashford," he said gently, "your father has been asking for you constantly. He's very weak, but he's lucid and determined to stay conscious until you arrive. Please, come with me." Evelyn looked back at Alexander, suddenly uncertain. He stepped forward and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be right here," he promised. "Take all the time you need with your father. We'll handle everything else." Lord Henry's chambers were dim, curtains drawn against the brightness of the day. He lay propped against pillows, his face waxen and drawn, but his eyes brightened when Evelyn entered. "My girl," he whispered, his voice thin as paper. "You came." "Of course I came," Evelyn said, rushing to his bedside and taking his hand in both of hers. "I'm here, Father. I'm safe." Thanks to the Duke, Lord Henry managed a weak smile. "I knew he was the right man. Knew it the moment I met him." His eyes shifted past Evelyn to where Alexander stood in the doorway. "Your Grace, thank you for bringing my daughter home." "The honor is mine, Lord Henry," Alexander said, entering and approaching the bed with respectful deference. "And I want you to know that Evelyn has agreed to marry me. With your blessing, we'll proceed immediately. Today, if possible." Lord Henry's face transformed with relief and joy so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Today," he repeated. "Yes, God, yes. I never thought." His voice broke, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "I never thought I'd see this day. Never thought I could leave this world knowing she was truly safe." "You can rest easy now," Alexander said firmly. "I give you my word as a gentleman and as a man who will soon be your son, that Evelyn will never want for anything. Not protection, not comfort, not the freedom to be herself. She will have everything in my power to provide." "I know," Lord Henry said, his gaze moving between them. "I see it in how you look at her, the same way I looked at her mother." He turned back to Evelyn, his hand trembling in hers. "He's a good man, my darling. A truly good man. Let yourself be happy with him. Let yourself believe you deserve this." "I'll try, Father," Evelyn promised, her vision blurred with tears. "I'll try to be brave." "You are brave," Lord Henry insisted. "You've always been brave. You survived Beatrice, survived years of cruelty that would have broken a lesser spirit. You'll survive this too. Not just survive, but flourish." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "I've arranged everything. The vicar is waiting in the chapel. The household staff are assembled as witnesses. All that's needed is for you to say yes." Evelyn looked at Alexander, finding his steady gaze waiting for her. There was no pressure in his expression, no demand, just quiet support and the promise he had made. To try to be honest, to build something real. She thought about the alternative, about what would have happened if he hadn't come for her, if Lady Beatrice's plot had succeeded. She thought about the light her father spoke of. The light she had been told her whole life was too bright, too much, something to be dimmed and controlled. Maybe, she thought, it was time to let it shine. Maybe this unexpected marriage to this unexpected man was exactly the freedom she needed to become herself. "Then let's not keep the vicar waiting," she said, squeezing her father's hand. "Let's do this now, so you can witness it properly." Lord Henry's smile was transcendent. "Help me up," he ordered Dr. Harrison, who had been hovering near the door. "I'll not watch my daughter marry from my deathbed. I'll stand beside her as a father should." "Lord Henry, I must protest," the physician began, but Lord Henry cut him off with a surprisingly sharp gesture. "I'm dying anyway, Harrison. Let me do this one last thing with dignity. Help me up or get out of my way." Between Dr. Harrison and Alexander, they managed to help Lord Henry into a dressing gown and support him as he walked, painfully slowly but with determination, down to the family chapel. Evelyn walked beside them, her hand on her father's arm, feeling the fragility of his body and the strength of his spirit warring with each other. The chapel was small and intimate, decorated with flowers that someone had hastily arranged. The household staff were indeed assembled, Sarah among them, her eyes red from crying but her smile genuine when she saw Evelyn. Mr. Whitmore stood ready to serve as witness, along with Dr. Harrison. The vicar, Reverend Ashford, A distant relation who had known Evelyn since childhood waited at the altar with his prayer book open. It wasn't the grand society wedding Evelyn might have imagined as a girl. There was no elegant dress, no strings of pearls, no crowd of witnesses from the ton. Just a simple ceremony in a quiet chapel, performed for an audience of servants and one dying man who needed to see his daughter safe before he could let go. And somehow, that made it more meaningful than any elaborate affair could have been. Evelyn and Alexander stood before the altar, and she was struck by how tall he seemed, how solid and real. His hand, when it took hers, was warm and steady. His voice, as he repeated his vows, was clear and certain. When it came time for Evelyn to speak, she found her own voice steady as well, surprising herself with the firmness of her commitment. She meant these words. Whatever uncertainty she felt about the future, whatever questions remained about their compatibility, in this moment she meant every promise she made, to honor him, to stand beside him, to try with everything she had to make this work. When Reverend Ashford pronounced them husband and wife, when Alexander leaned in to kiss her gently, properly, chastely, but with a warmth that hinted at possibilities yet to be explored, Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but the opening of a door, the beginning of a path she hadn't known existed. Lord Henry wept openly as he embraced them both, his frail arms barely able to encompass them. "My children," he said, the words trembling with emotion. "My beloved children, thank you. Thank you for giving me this gift." They helped him back to his chambers after the ceremony, and Evelyn sat beside his bed, holding his hand, while Alexander stood by the window, giving them privacy but remaining close. Lord Henry spoke little now, his energy spent by the effort of attending the wedding, but his face held peace, a contentment Evelyn hadn't seen in months. "Tell me about your mother," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "The day you were born." Evelyn had heard the story 100 times, but she settled in to listen once more, knowing this might be the last telling. Lord Henry spoke haltingly of his wife's courage, of her laughter even through the pain, of how she had held Evelyn once, just once, before the bleeding started, that couldn't be stopped. "She said you had wise eyes," Lord Henry whispered, "said you would be extraordinary." And she was right. She was always right. His breathing grew more labored as afternoon faded into evening. Dr. Harrison gave him something for the pain, and his consciousness began to slip. But even as he faded, his hand stayed firm in Evelyn's, an anchor holding him to this world just a little longer. Alexander brought her tea and food that she barely touched. He draped a blanket around her shoulders when the room grew cold. He spoke quietly with Dr. Harrison about arrangements that would need to be made. And through it all he remained present, not hovering or intrusive, but steadily there, a support she could lean on if needed. As night fell fully and the household grew quiet, Lord Henry opened his eyes one last time. His gaze found Evelyn's face, and then Alexander's, and a small smile touched his lips. "Perfect," he breathed. "Everything. Perfect." Those were his final words. His hand went lax in Evelyn's, his breathing stilled, and Lord Henry Ashford slipped peacefully from the world, leaving his daughter in the protection of a man he trusted, and in the tentative beginning of what might become love. Evelyn sat in silence for a long time, holding her father's still hand, unable to quite process that he was gone. She had known this was coming, had been preparing for it in abstract ways, but the reality of his absence struck her with unexpected force. The room felt emptier somehow, as if his spirit had taken warmth and light with it when it departed. Alexander approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn," he said, his voice rough with genuine emotion. He was a good man, the best kind of father. "He was," Evelyn whispered, finally releasing her father's hand and allowing Alexander to draw her to her feet. "He tried so hard to protect me, even when he was too weak to fight her, even at the end. And he succeeded," Alexander reminded her gently. "You're safe now. That's what he wanted most." Dr. Harrison came forward to perform the necessary tasks, and Alexander guided Evelyn from the room with careful consideration. They walked through the darkened corridors of Ashford Manor, past portraits of ancestors who had lived and died in these halls, past rooms full of memories both sweet and bitter. "You should rest," Alexander said, as they reached what had been Evelyn's chambers. Then he paused, seeming to realize the awkwardness of the situation. They were married now, but barely knew each other. The conventions of wedding nights pressed against the grief of her father's death, creating an uncomfortable tangle of expectations and proprieties. "I don't want to be alone," Evelyn said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "Not tonight. Not with him just—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Alexander studied her face carefully. "Then you won't be," he said simply. "But Evelyn, I want you to understand, I have no expectations, not tonight, not until you're ready. I meant what I said about building something real between us. That takes time, and it certainly shouldn't be rushed by grief or obligation." The relief that flooded through her was profound. "Thank you," she breathed. I need to not be alone in the dark. I need to know someone is there." "Then I'll stay," Alexander promised. "I'll sit by the fire and read, or simply keep watch, whatever you need." They settled into an arrangement that felt both intimate and respectful. Evelyn changed into a nightdress with Sarah's help, the maid crying softly as she worked, mourning the master who had always treated her kindly. When Evelyn emerged from behind the screen, she found Alexander seated by the fireplace, his jacket removed and his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking more relaxed than she had yet seen him. He had somehow procured a book from the library, and true to his word he simply read while she climbed into bed. But the presence of him there, solid and real in the firelight, kept the worst of the grief and fear at bay. She watched him for a while, noting the way the light played across his features, the occasional furrow of concentration between his brows, the elegant length of his fingers as he turned pages. "Alexander," she said softly into the quiet. He looked up immediately. "Yes? Will you tell me something real about yourself, something that matters to you?" He considered for a moment, closing the book on his finger to mark his place. "I told you about my sister," he began. "Clara. She died when she was 7 and I was 12. Scarlet fever. It devastated my parents, my mother especially. She never quite recovered from losing her only daughter." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, hearing the pain beneath his carefully controlled words. "It changed everything in our house," Alexander continued. "The lightness left. My father threw himself into managing the estate, into politics and duty. My mother retreated into grief. And I—" He paused, his gaze distant. "I learned to be what they needed. Responsible, controlled, perfect. I became the heir they required rather than the brother who had failed to protect his sister." "You were 12, Evelyn protested. "You couldn't have prevented an illness." "Logically, I know that," Alexander said. "But logic and feeling are different things. I made myself into someone who could shoulder any burden, handle any crisis, never crack under pressure. It served me well in many ways. But it also made me—" he searched for the word— "isolated. People find me cold, distant. They're not entirely wrong." Evelyn sat up in bed, pulling her knees to her chest. "You haven't been cold with me." "No," Alexander agreed, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "With you, I find I want to be different, want to let those walls down, at least partially. It's terrifying, if I'm honest." The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Evelyn's chest. Here was this powerful, controlled man confessing his fears, offering her pieces of himself that she suspected few people ever saw. It felt like trust, fragile and precious. "I'm terrified too," she admitted. "Of all of this. Of marriage. Of the future. Of whether I can be what you need. Lady Beatrice spent years convincing me I was deficient in every way that mattered. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my head, cataloguing my failures." "Then we'll have to work together to silence that voice," Alexander said firmly. "Because she was wrong about you, Evelyn. Fundamentally, completely wrong. You're not deficient. You're extraordinary in ways she could never understand because she lacked the capacity to value what makes you special." "How can you be so certain?" Evelyn asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Alexander replied. "I know that you risked Lady Beatrice's wrath to help people who couldn't help themselves. I know that you inspired loyalty in servants who had every reason to keep their heads down and protect themselves. I know that even after years of cruelty, you still have compassion for your stepmother, misguided perhaps, but genuine. That speaks to a strength of character that can't be faked or taught." Evelyn felt tears sliding down her cheeks, But they weren't tears of grief this time. They were something else, relief maybe, or the overwhelming emotion of being truly seen, truly valued, after so long in the shadows. "Come here," she said impulsively, patting the bed beside her. "Please, I don't want you all the way over there." Alexander hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against her request. But then he rose and crossed to the bed, settling carefully on top of the covers beside her, maintaining a respectful distance even as he drew closer. "Better?" he asked. "Much," Evelyn said, and found it was true. Having him near but not crowding her, present but not demanding, felt exactly right. "Tell me more," she requested, "about your travels, about the places you've seen. Help me imagine a world beyond these walls." So he did. Alexander spoke quietly into the darkness about Venice and its canals reflecting sunset, about Vienna and its music filling grand concert halls, about the Scottish Highlands, where the wind tasted of heather and salt. His descriptions were vivid and careful, painting pictures that let Evelyn escape temporarily from the grief and upheaval of the day. Somewhere in the midst of his story about Istanbul's markets, the colours and sounds and overwhelming abundance, Evelyn felt her eyes growing heavy. She tried to fight it, wanting to hear more, but exhaustion from the emotional toll of the past 2 days finally claimed her. The last thing she was aware of was Alexander's voice, steady and soothing, and the warmth of his presence beside her. She slept without dreams, without nightmares, held safe by the simple fact of not being alone. When she woke in the pale light of dawn, she found Alexander still there, though he had moved to the chair by the window. He was asleep himself, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, his book fallen to the floor beside him. He had kept vigil through the night, honouring his promise to stay, to keep the darkness at bay. Evelyn rose quietly and fetched a blanket, draping it carefully over his sleeping form. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, and she allowed herself a moment to simply look at him, this man who was now her husband, who had charged to her rescue, who had promised her honesty and patience and the chance to build something real. The days that followed were strange and painful. Ashford Manor had to be prepared for Lord Henry's funeral, invitations sent, arrangements made. Alexander handled most of it with Mr. Whitmore's help, shielding Evelyn from the worst of the details, while still consulting her on what she wanted. "It should be simple," she told him when they discussed the service. "My father never cared for elaborate displays. Just family, close friends, the tenants he loved. Nothing more." "Then that's what it will be," Alexander promised. The funeral was held on a grey afternoon that matched the mood of the mourners. The village turned out in force, tenant farmers and shopkeepers standing alongside the few aristocratic friends Lord Henry had maintained. Noticeably absent was Lady Beatrice, who had been explicitly forbidden from attending by both Alexander and Lord Henry's solicitor. Evelyn stood at the graveside beside her husband, accepting condolences from people who had known her father, who had stories to share about his kindness or fairness or humour. Many of them eyed Alexander with curiosity, this powerful duke who had swept in during a crisis and married the grieving daughter with startling speed. "Your father spoke highly of you, Your Grace," one elderly farmer said, shaking Alexander's hand. "Said you were a man of honour. We're glad Miss Evelyn, pardon Your Grace, has someone to look after her now." "I consider it my privilege," Alexander replied, his hand finding the small of Evelyn's back in a gesture of support. "Lord Henry was a remarkable man. I only wish I had known him longer." After the burial, after the guests had departed and the house had fallen quiet again, Evelyn found herself in her father's study. It smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, achingly familiar. She sat in his chair by the window where she had said goodbye to him just days ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Alexander found her there as evening fell, bringing tea and sitting quietly until she was ready to speak. "I keep thinking I should feel more," Evelyn said finally. "More devastated, more lost. But mostly I just feel numb, and guilty for feeling numb." "Grief doesn't follow rules," Alexander said gently. "It comes in waves, in unexpected moments. The numbness is protection, letting you process things gradually rather than all at once. Be patient with yourself." "Were you numb when your sister died?" Evelyn asked. "For a while," Alexander admitted, then angry. then desperately sad, then numb again. It cycled for months, maybe years. I'm not sure I've ever fully processed it, to be honest. I just learned to carry it. Evelyn looked at him, this man who carried so much beneath his controlled exterior. We're quite a pair, she said with a sad smile. Both broken in our own ways. Or both healing, Alexander suggested. Maybe that's what we can do for each other. Create a safe space to heal. The idea resonated with something deep in Evelyn's chest. Maybe that was what this marriage could be at its heart. Not a fairy tale romance, not a desperate escape, but something quieter and more profound. A partnership built on understanding, on shared wounds, and the courage to tend them together. I'd like that, she said softly. Very much. They remained in Lord Henry's study until the stars came out, talking about small things and large ones, sharing silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward. And when they finally retired for the night, walking together through the darkened manor, Evelyn felt something shift between them. Not passion or overwhelming love, but the deepening of trust. The sense that they were truly in this together, whatever this might become. 3 weeks after Lord Henry's funeral, Evelyn stood in the drawing room of Blackthorn Hall, staring out at gardens that were beginning to show the first signs of spring. Alexander's ancestral home was grand in ways that Ashford Manor had never been. A sprawling estate with formal gardens, a lake, and enough rooms that she was still discovering new ones. The move from her childhood home had been bittersweet. Ashford Manor would be maintained by a steward, kept ready should Evelyn ever wish to return, but her life was here now, with Alexander, in this beautiful, slightly overwhelming place that was now her home. You're thinking too hard again, came Alexander's voice from the doorway. I can see it in the way you're holding your shoulders. Evelyn turned to find her husband watching her with that particular intensity he brought to everything he did. Over the past weeks, they had fallen into patterns, meals together where they discussed books and politics, evenings in the library where they read companionably, morning rides through the estate where Alexander showed her the land piece by piece. They were learning each other slowly, carefully, building something that felt increasingly solid. But they had yet to truly be husband and wife in the fullest sense. Alexander had maintained his promise not to push, to give her time to grieve and adjust, and Evelyn had appreciated that restraint, even as she became increasingly aware of a different kind of tension building between them. I was thinking about how much has changed, she said, moving away from the window. A month ago I was trapped in Ashford Manor under Lady Beatrice's thumb. Now I'm the Duchess of Blackthorn, mistress of an estate I'm still learning to navigate. It feels surreal. Do you regret it? Alexander asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. The speed of everything, the way circumstances forced our hand. No, Evelyn said immediately, surprised by her own certainty. No, I don't regret marrying you, but I wonder sometimes if you regret it. If you feel trapped by a choice you made under pressure. Alexander crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking her hands in his. Listen to me carefully, Evelyn. I don't feel trapped. I feel... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I feel like I've been waiting for something my entire life without knowing what it was, and then you appeared. You challenge me, make me question my assumptions, force me to feel things I've kept buried for years. That's not a trap. That's freedom. The intensity in his eyes made Evelyn's breath catch. They stood close together, his hands warm on hers, and she became acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his shirt collar was slightly open, showing the hollow of his throat, of the faint scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that she had come to associate with safety and warmth. Alexander, she said softly, his name feeling important on her lips. I need to tell you something. Anything, he promised. I'm not grieving anymore, not in the way that requires distance and careful handling. She took a breath, gathering courage. I miss my father, and I always will, but I'm ready to move forward, to truly be your wife, if you still want that. Something flared in Alexander's expression, hope and desire and careful restraint all warring together. I want that very much, he said, his voice rough. But only if you're certain. Only if this is what you truly want, and not what you think you should do. I'm certain, Evelyn said, stepping closer until their bodies were nearly touching. I want to know you in every way. I want to build this life with you completely, not just in theory. I want—" She faltered slightly, unused to expressing desires so directly. "Tell me," Alexander encouraged gently. "Whatever it is, tell me." "I want you to kiss me," Evelyn said, the words coming out in a rush. "Really kiss me, not the chaste touches we've exchanged. I want to know what it feels like to be wanted by you." Alexander's control, usually so perfect, cracked at her words. He cupped her face in his hands, with a tenderness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. "You have no idea how much I want you," he said roughly. "How difficult it's been to maintain distance, to be patient when all I wanted was to—" He didn't finish with words. Instead, he closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her with a thoroughness that made her knees weak. This was nothing like their wedding kiss or the brief touches they had exchanged since. This was heat and desire, carefully unleashed, his mouth claiming hers with a passion that had been held in check too long. Evelyn's hands came up to grip his shoulders, needing the anchor as sensation overwhelmed her. She had been kissed before, brief, furtive encounters at balls that Lady Beatrice had discovered and punished her for. But this was different. This was her husband, kissing her with intent and desire, and she was free to kiss him back without fear of consequences. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Evelyn," he breathed, "are you absolutely certain? Because if we continue, I'm not sure I'll be able to stop." "Then don't stop," she said, surprised by her own boldness. "Take me upstairs, Alexander. Make me truly your wife." What followed was both awkward and beautiful, in ways Evelyn hadn't expected. Alexander led her to his chambers, their chambers, she corrected herself, and undressed her with hands that trembled slightly despite his experience. He murmured reassurances and praise, telling her she was beautiful, perfect, everything he had imagined, and more. Evelyn discovered that physical intimacy was more vulnerable than she had anticipated, but also more connecting. The way Alexander watched her face, checking constantly for her comfort and pleasure. The way his hands mapped her body with reverence rather than mere desire. The way he held her afterward, his heartbeat steady against her cheek, made her feel genuinely treasured. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "I didn't hurt you." "No," Evelyn said honestly. "It was intense, strange, but good, right." She felt his smile against her hair. "It will get better," he promised, "as we learn each other, as you become more comfortable. This is just the beginning." The beginning. The words resonated with possibility. This marriage that had started from crisis and necessity was transforming into something real and chosen. Evelyn found herself smiling, contentment settling over her like a warm blanket. They spent the afternoon in bed, talking and touching and discovering each other, with a freedom that felt revolutionary after so many years of repression under Lady Beatrice's roof. Alexander shared more stories about his travels, his struggles with his parents' expectations, his fears about whether he could be the husband Evelyn deserved. Evelyn, in turn, told him about her mother, not just the idealized version Lord Henry had painted, but the woman she had pieced together from servants' memories and her father's unguarded moments. A woman who had been bright and curious and unconventional, who had scandalized society by learning Greek and corresponding with philosophers. "You're very like her," Alexander observed, "from what you've described. That same curiosity, that hunger to understand the world beyond society's narrow confines." "Lady Beatrice hated that about me," Evelyn said. "She called it unfeminine, inappropriate. She tried so hard to make me smaller." "She failed," Alexander said firmly, pulling her closer. "You're magnificent, Evelyn, and I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never doubt that again." The weeks that followed established new rhythms in their marriage. Days spent exploring the estate together, Evelyn learning the names of tenants and the details of land management that Alexander handled with careful competence. Evenings in the library where they debated philosophy and politics, Evelyn discovering that her opinions were not just tolerated but actively valued. Nights where they came together with increasing confidence and pleasure, learning the language of each other's bodies. But it wasn't all smooth progress. There were moments of friction, times when Alexander's need for control clashed with Evelyn's hard-won independence, when he tried to shield her from unpleasant estate business and she insisted on being fully informed, when she challenged his assumptions about social reform and he initially dismissed her ideas before being forced to reconsider. "We're both strong-willed," Evelyn observed one evening after a particularly heated debate about tenant housing improvements. "This isn't going to be easy, is it?" "No," Alexander agreed, pulling her into his arms despite their disagreement. "But I don't want easy. I want real. And real means conflict sometimes, means having to work things out and compromise and grow." "As long as you remember I'm not your subordinate," Evelyn said firmly. "I'm your partner. That means my voice matters equally." "Agreed," Alexander said, kissing her forehead. "Though I reserve the right to try to convince you when I think you're wrong." "As do I," Evelyn replied with a slight smile. "May the best argument win." Spring deepened into summer, and Evelyn began to truly make Blackthorn Hall her own. She reopened rooms that had been closed since Alexander's mother's death, filling them with light and flowers and life. She established relationships with the tenants, visiting families and learning their concerns. She started a small school in the village, teaching children to read using methods she had observed during her limited travels. Alexander watched these transformations with pride and something deeper, genuine admiration for the woman he had married. Evelyn was not content to be merely decorative or passive. She wanted to contribute, to make a difference, to use her position for good. And he found himself falling more deeply in love with her with each passing day. The realization struck him one evening as he watched her teaching a tenant's daughter to play the pianoforte. Evelyn's face was alive with concentration and pleasure, her patience endless as she guided the child's small fingers over the keys, and Alexander felt his heart constrict with an emotion so powerful it almost frightened him. He loved her, not just desired her or appreciated her or felt affection for her. He was genuinely, completely in love with his wife. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified him. He had spent so many years protecting himself from deep feeling, from vulnerability, that opening himself to love felt dangerous. What if something happened to her? What if he lost her the way his family had lost Clara? What if this happiness was temporary, destined to be snatched away by fate or illness, or any of the 1,000 tragedies that could befall them? "You're thinking too hard again," Evelyn said, appearing beside him in the doorway. The lesson had ended, and the tenant family had departed with many thanks. "I can see it in your face." "Just watching you," Alexander said, pulling her close, "marveling at how lucky I am." "We're both lucky," Evelyn corrected. "We found each other despite everything working against us. Lady Beatrice's schemes, the timing, the circumstances. We still managed to make this work." "It's more than working," Alexander said, deciding in that moment to be honest about what he felt. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something important." She looked up at him, curiosity and slight concern in her expression. "All right." "I love you," he said simply, the words feeling both momentous and natural. "Not just care for you or desire you, though both are true. I'm in love with you, completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love with you." Evelyn's eyes widened, her breath catching. For a moment she simply stared at him, and Alexander felt a spike of fear that perhaps she didn't feel the same, that he had confessed too soon, exposed himself unnecessarily. Then she smiled, a smile so radiant it seemed to light the entire room. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon, or that you didn't feel the same. But I do. I love you, Alexander. I think I've been falling in love with you since you stopped that carriage and looked at me like I mattered." The kiss that followed was different from all the ones before. It carried the weight of their confessions, the promise of a future built not just on respect and partnership, but on genuine love. When they finally pulled apart, both were laughing slightly, giddy with the relief of mutual confession. "How did we get so lucky?" Evelyn asked, resting her head against his chest. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, "but I'm grateful every day." As summer turned toward autumn, news reached them that Lady Beatrice had left England entirely, retreating to distant relatives on the continent in disgrace. Her attempts to contest Lord Henry's will had failed spectacularly, leaving her with nothing but the small dowry she had brought to the marriage. Some might have felt vindication at her downfall, but Evelyn found she felt only a distant sadness. She destroyed herself. Evelyn said when Alexander shared the news. "I can't take pleasure in that, even after everything she did." "Your capacity for compassion continues to amaze me," Alexander said, pulling her close. "Though I admit, I'm relieved she's far away where she can't cause you any more pain." "She can't hurt me anymore," Evelyn said with quiet certainty. "Not because she's gone, but because I finally understand my own worth. You helped me see that, Alexander. You and this life we're building together." They were sitting in the garden, enjoying the last warm days before autumn's chill, when Mr. Whitmore approached with a letter. "From Lady Sarah Ashford, Your Grace," he said, handing it to Evelyn with a slight smile. "Your former maid has news, it seems." Evelyn opened the letter eagerly. True to her word, she had ensured Sarah's protection and advancement after Lady Beatrice's expulsion. The young woman was now head housekeeper at Ashford Manor, managing the staff and estate in preparation for whatever future use Evelyn might have for her childhood home. The letter was full of news about the estate and the village, but it was the final paragraph that made Evelyn gasp. "Alexander, listen to this. Sarah writes that she's received a proposal of marriage from the estate steward, Mr. Thomas Fletcher. She's asking for my blessing and help planning the wedding." "That's wonderful," Alexander said warmly. "Fletcher is a good man, competent, honest, kind. They'll suit each other well." "We should host the wedding here," Evelyn said immediately. "At Blackthorn Hall. Make it a proper celebration. Sarah risked everything to help me, and I want to show her how much that meant." The wedding of Sarah Fletcher, née Wilson, to Thomas Fletcher was held 6 weeks later in the chapel at Blackthorn Hall. It was a modest affair by aristocratic standards, but lavish for servants, with fine food and music and dancing that continued into the night. Evelyn insisted on standing as Sarah's witness, scandalizing some of the older servants, but delighting most of the younger ones who had heard the story of how Sarah had helped save their new duchess. As Evelyn watched Sarah and Thomas exchange vows, she found her hand seeking Alexander's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Less than a year ago, she had been a prisoner in her own home, convinced she had no value, no future, no hope. Now she was a duchess, a wife, a woman discovering her own strength and purpose. "Happy?" Alexander murmured in her ear. "Deliriously," Evelyn replied, turning to smile at him. "Who knew that having your carriage stopped on a muddy road could lead to this?" "I did," Alexander said with surprising firmness. "From the moment I saw you in that garden, I knew you were going to change my life. I just didn't realize how completely, or how much for the better." The celebration continued around them, but for a moment they existed in their own small world, two people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built something real from crisis and necessity, who had transformed a marriage of protection into genuine partnership and love. As autumn deepened, and the first hints of winter approached, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. The news was both thrilling and terrifying, bringing with it memories of her mother's death and fears about her own fate. But Alexander was steadfast in his support, hiring the best physicians, ensuring her comfort, and refusing to let her spiral into worry. "You're not your mother," he reminded her gently when she voiced her fears. "And medicine has advanced considerably since then. You're strong, Evelyn, stronger than you know. Promise me something," she said one evening as they sat together by the fire, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "If something happens, if it comes down to a choice—" "Nothing is going to happen," Alexander interrupted firmly. "But if such a choice were necessary, I would choose you. Always you. I'm sorry if that sounds cruel to our child, but I cannot lose you. I won't lose you." The fierce declaration both comforted and worried her. "You might not have a choice," she said softly. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," Alexander promised. "But I choose to believe in a future where we're both here, where our child grows up knowing both parents, where we have the life we've begun to build." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, defying Evelyn's worst fears. Dr. Harrison, who had attended her father in his final days, came monthly to check on her progress and pronounced her healthy and strong. Alexander hovered protectively but tried not to smother, a balance that required constant negotiation and occasional arguments. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Evelyn protested when he tried to prevent her from riding. I need exercise and fresh air, not to be wrapped in cotton wool." "I'm simply concerned for your safety," Alexander countered. "You're being overprotective," Evelyn corrected. "And if you don't ease back, I'm going to start making decisions without consulting you at all, just to prove my independence." They compromised. Shorter rides at slower paces, with Alexander or a groom always accompanying her. It wasn't perfect, but it was negotiation, the give and take that made their partnership work. As winter gave way to spring again, as Evelyn's body changed and grew with their child, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago she had been on a carriage to nowhere, destined for erasure and oblivion. Now she carried new life, built new traditions, made a home with a man who loved her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that carriage?" she asked Alexander one evening as they prepared for bed. "Every day," he admitted, helping her into her nightdress with gentle care. "And every day I'm grateful I did. Grateful that Whitmore discovered the plot, grateful that we rode fast enough, grateful for every choice that led to you being here. Safe, mine." "Ours," Evelyn corrected with a smile. "We belong to each other now." "Ours," Alexander agreed, kissing her with lingering tenderness. "Always ours." The baby arrived on a warm day in late May, after hours of labor that tested both Evelyn's endurance and Alexander's composure. He refused to leave her side despite convention and the physician's protests, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, even as his own fear threatened to overwhelm him. When their daughter finally entered the world with a healthy cry, when Evelyn was pronounced safe and well, Alexander broke down completely, years of controlled emotion finally releasing in tears of relief and joy. "A girl," Evelyn whispered, cradling their daughter against her chest. "We have a daughter, Alexander." "She's perfect," Alexander said roughly, his fingers gently tracing their daughter's tiny face. "You're both perfect." They named her Clara Margaret, Clara for Alexander's lost sister, a way of honoring that grief while celebrating this new life, and Margaret for Evelyn's mother, connecting past and present in ways that felt meaningful. The baby had Alexander's dark hair and what promised to be his striking features, but her eyes, when they opened, were a warm brown like Evelyn's and Lord Henry's. "She's going to be extraordinary," Alexander predicted, watching Clara sleep in Evelyn's arms. "Just like her mother." "She's going to be loved," Evelyn corrected gently. "That's what matters most. She'll grow up knowing she's valued, knowing she can be herself without apology. Everything I didn't have, we'll give to her." "Everything and more," Alexander promised. The christening was held in the village church, attended by tenants and neighbors, and the few aristocratic friends Alexander counted as genuine. Sarah and Thomas Fletcher stood as godparents, a choice that raised eyebrows among the ton, but felt exactly right to both Evelyn and Alexander. As Reverend Ashford performed the ceremony, as little Clara fussed in her elaborate christening gown, Evelyn found her eyes meeting Alexander's across their daughter's head. In his gaze she saw everything they had built together, the trust earned through honesty, the partnership forged in crisis, the love that had grown from uncertain beginnings into something profound and lasting. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. "For what?" he mouthed back. "For stopping the carriage," she replied. "For everything that came after." His smile was tender and knowing. They both understood that the crisis that had brought them together was now simply backstory, the dramatic opening to a much longer tale still being written. What mattered was what they had chosen to do with that beginning, how they had taken circumstances, thrust upon them and transformed them into genuine connection. As summer stretched before them, full of promise and new challenges, Evelyn held her daughter and felt complete in ways she had never imagined possible. She thought of her father, hoping he could see this somehow, see that his desperate wish to protect her had blossomed into something far richer than mere safety. She thought of Lady Beatrice, hoping the woman had found some measure of peace in her exile, though knowing such grace was unlikely for someone so consumed by bitterness. But mostly she thought about the future, about raising Clara with Alexander, about growing old together, about all the ordinary and extraordinary moments yet to come. The carriage that had been stopped on a muddy road had carried her not toward oblivion, but toward a destiny richer than any she could have dreamed. And as Alexander's hand found hers, as their fingers intertwined in the familiar gesture that had become their private language of connection, Evelyn understood that the true romance of their story wasn't in the dramatic rescue. It was in every day that came after, the choice to keep choosing each other, to keep building together, to keep believing in the possibility of joy. "Shall we go home?" Alexander asked softly as the ceremony concluded. "Yes," Evelyn replied, cradling their daughter close. "Let's go home. Home to Blackthorn Hall, where new traditions were being built and old wounds were healing. Home to a life that had begun in crisis, but had transformed into something beautiful through courage, honesty, and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. Home to each other, and to the future they were creating together." The carriage, a different one, comfortable and familiar, carried them back through the countryside as afternoon sunlight gilded everything in gold. And Evelyn, looking at her husband and daughter, at the life they had made, felt her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for every choice that had led to this moment. The nightmare that Lady Beatrice had designed had been transformed by courage and love into a dream more beautiful than Evelyn had dared imagine. And as Alexander's arms came around her, sheltering both wife and daughter in protective warmth, she knew that this was only the beginning of their story. The best was yet to come. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Evelyn and Alexander's journey from desperation to hope, from crisis to love. If this story touched your heart, we'd be so grateful if you could subscribe to our channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit that like button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next romantic tale. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you more stories of courage, love, and happily ever afters. Until next time, may you all find your own extraordinary love story.